The barn was already burning when Miriam Ashcroft stepped off the wagon. She didn't scream, she didn't freeze. She grabbed the nearest water bucket, handed a second one to the oldest girl standing paralyzed in the doorway, and said, "Move your feet, sweetheart. Crying comes after." Nobody in Dalton Creek had expected much from the widower's new housekeeper. They'd taken one look at her plain wool coat and sturdy boots and already written their verdict. Every single one of them would be wrong. This is the story of a woman nobody wanted, a family on the edge of losing everything, and a valley that learned, too late almost, what it means to underestimate the wrong person. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first hard frost of the season hit Dalton Creek 3 days before Miriam Ashcroft arrived, and most folks took that as a sign. Not a good one. The kind of sign that old Hetty Bowman at the general store would nod about slowly, pressing her lips together the way she always did before delivering a verdict dressed up as concern. "Early frost means a bitter winter," she'd say, and everybody knew she wasn't just talking about the weather. Gideon Hale had driven the wagon into town himself that morning to collect her from the stage stop, which was unusual. He almost never left the ranch during the week. People noticed. They always noticed things about Gideon. The way he'd aged hard since Clara died. The way his shoulders carried something heavier than a man's shoulders were built to carry. The way his 3 girls sometimes stood on the porch watching the road like they were waiting for a woman who was never coming back. He tied the horse outside the stage stop and sat with his hands on his knees for a long moment before climbing down. Inside, the stagecoach had already arrived. There were 4 passengers, a traveling merchant with ink-stained fingers, a young couple pressed close together, the wife holding a hat box with both hands. And then there was Miriam Ashcroft, standing slightly apart from the others with a large canvas bag at her feet and a smaller leather satchel across one shoulder, reading a folded newspaper as if she had all the time in the world. Gideon looked at her, then looked past her, then looked at her again. He'd written to an agency in Billings 3 months ago. The letter had been careful and specific. Housekeeper needed, 3 children, working ranch, not easy work, must be capable, references required. He hadn't written anything about age or appearance because that felt wrong somehow, though in the back of his mind he'd pictured someone young, efficient, maybe a little like Clara had been before the years wore her down, quick with her hands and quicker with a smile. The woman standing by the door reading a newspaper was none of those things. She was, he estimated, somewhere in her mid-30s, though it was hard to tell exactly, broad-shouldered in a practical way. Her face was weathered around the eyes. Her dark hair was tucked under a plain hat with no decoration on it whatsoever. She was reading the newspaper with a small frown of concentration, and when she finally looked up and found him staring, she didn't look away. "Mr. Hale?" she said. Her voice was even, not warm, not cold. "That's me." He crossed the room and held out his hand. "You're Miss Ashcroft." "Mrs.?" she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Widowed. The agency should have noted that." "Right." He picked up her canvas bag without asking and immediately regretted it because it was heavier than he expected, and he had to work to keep his face neutral. "This all you have?" "And the satchel." She folded the newspaper and tucked it under her arm. "I read ahead on the stage. Montana Territory has had 3 land disputes go to court in the last 4 months. Interesting times out here." Gideon didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and they rode out of town in a silence that was not exactly uncomfortable, but was not comfortable either. The sky above the mountains was the color of old pewter. Wind came off the ridge in cold, uneven gusts that made the horse's ears flatten. After about 10 minutes, Miriam said, "How old are the girls?" "Ruth is 14, Nora's 11, little Beth just turned 7 in September." "Who's been running the house since your wife passed?" A muscle in Gideon's jaw moved. "Ruth, mostly." "For how long?" 2 years, give or take." Miriam looked out at the landscape. A long fence line ran beside the road, some of the posts leaning badly, one section sagging toward the ground. She saw it. She didn't say anything about it, but she saw it. "Any specific instructions before I arrive?" she asked. "Just, the girls aren't easy right now." Children who've lost their mother generally aren't. He glanced at her sideways. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the road. Frost Ridge came into view around a long bend. The main house first, 2 stories, white paint that had been white several years ago and was now closer to the color of old bone. The barn behind it. The outbuildings. 2 horses in the near paddock. Smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, which meant Ruth was already cooking. Gideon pulled the wagon around to the front and climbed down. The girls were on the porch. They'd been arranged there somewhat deliberately, he could tell. Ruth standing straight and arms crossed, Nora half hidden behind her, Beth sitting on the top step with her knees pulled to her chest. Miriam climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She stood in the yard and looked at them. They looked back at her. He watched his daughters' faces register their private disappointments one by one. Ruth's expression going carefully blank the way it did when she was keeping herself from saying something, Nora's eyes cutting sideways, Beth tilting her head in a way that meant she was confused. The silence stretched. Then Beth said, plainly and without any cruelty, "You're not what we thought you'd be." Ruth made a sharp sound. "Beth!" "It's all right," Miriam said. She looked at Beth directly. "What did you think I'd be?" Beth considered this with the alarming honesty only 7-year-olds can manage. Younger and prettier, maybe. "Beth, stop it." "Ruth." Miriam turns to the oldest girl. "She's not being unkind. She's being honest. Those are different things." She looked back at Beth. "You're probably right on both counts. I'm neither very young nor particularly pretty, but I can cook, I can keep a fire, I can sew a straight line, and I don't scare easy. Whether that's useful to you is something we'll figure out together." Beth stared at her, then cautiously, like something testing thin ice. "Can you make pie?" "What kind do you want?" "Apple." "I'll need to know where your root cellar is." Beth stood up and pointed. "I'll show you." That was the beginning of it. Gideon had expected friction. He hadn't expected it to come from himself. That first evening, after supper, he stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, listening to the sounds from inside. Beth's voice asking something, Miriam's lower voice answering, then the scrape of a chair. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds this house hadn't made in 2 years. It bothered him in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone. He went out to the barn. His ranch hand, Cody Briggs, 23 years old, good with horses, bad with silence, was forking hay in the near stall. He looked up when Gideon came in. "She settle in all right?" Cody asked. "Seems so." Cody waited. He'd worked for Gideon long enough to know when more was coming. "She's not what I expected," Gideon said. He picked up a loose piece of harness and turned it over in his hands. I don't know, direct." "Is that bad?" "I didn't say it was bad." "All right." Cody went back to the hay. "Ruth seemed tense when I came through for supper." "Ruth's always tense." "She's 14 and she's been running a household for 2 years, boss. I'd be tense too." Gideon set the harness down. "I'm aware of that, Cody." "Sure." A pause. "Just saying." He left the barn and stood outside for a minute, looking up at the ridge. The last of the evening light was dying behind it, going from purple to black. The temperature was already dropping hard. Somewhere out on the east pasture, one of the cattle was making a low, unhappy sound. He needed to check on the fence along the creek. The Perkins Ranch to the north had lost 3 head last week through a gap that shouldn't have existed. He needed to talk to the bank about the note coming due in January. He needed to figure out what was wrong with the water pump in the south paddock, and he needed to do it before the ground froze solid. He needed about 40 hours in every day, and he had 12 if he was lucky. He went back inside. The first real test came 3 days later. Miriam had been working quietly. Meals on time, house cleaner than it had been in months, Beth following her around like a small shadow. But she hadn't said much to Ruth, and Ruth hadn't said much to her. And everyone was pretending not to notice the tension between them. Then Gideon came in from the south paddock at noon and found Ruth at the kitchen table, face red, eyes dry in the deliberate way that meant she'd decided she was done crying. Miriam was at the stove. The silence between them had edges. "What happened?" Gideon asked. "Nothing," Ruth said. At the exact same moment Miriam said, "Ask Ruth to tell you about the Hensley order." Ruth's jaw tightened. "That's not your business." "You took an order from a neighbor to deliver 4 dozen preserves by Friday," Miriam said, still facing the stove. Her voice wasn't raised. "You've been filling it in addition to your regular chores, your schoolwork, and cooking every meal in this house. You didn't sleep last night. I could hear you at 2 in the morning." Ruth pushed back her chair. "I know you can handle it." Miriam turned around then. She looked at Ruth directly, and there was nothing soft about it. "That's not the point. The point is that you shouldn't have to." Something shifted in Ruth's face, a small thing, but Gideon saw it. "I made an agreement," Ruth said, "with Mrs. Hensley, and I'll help you fill it. 4 dozen is manageable in 2 afternoons if we work together." Miriam paused. "But you need to sleep, Ruth. You're 14 years old and you're running on smoke, and if you collapse from exhaustion, who takes care of your sisters?" It was the wrong thing to say. Or it should have been, but Ruth didn't blow up. She sat very still for a moment, and something behind her eyes moved and resettled, the way a load shifts when it's been carried too long. "I don't need you to help me," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "You don't need me to, but I'd like to." Miriam turned back to the stove. "You can tell me no. That's fine." A long silence. "Fine," Ruth said finally. She meant something different than no. Gideon slipped out without either of them noticing. He stood on the porch in the cold for a moment, holding that scene in his mind without fully understanding why it was making his chest feel strange. In town, the opinions had already formed. Hetty Bowman, to anyone who would listen, "I heard she's 36. 36. And plain as a fence post. Whatever Gideon Hale was thinking, it wasn't about those children." Warren Holt at the feed store had a theory that Miriam Ashcroft had probably exhausted her welcome in whatever town she'd come from and needed a fresh start somewhere. No one knew her. Evelyn Mercer, whose opinion carried more weight in Dalton Creek than anyone elected to anything, had said only this to 3 different women, all of whom repeated it to 6 more. A woman who shows up at a widower's ranch with 1 bag and no local references is a woman who has something to hide. Evelyn Mercer was elegant, well-connected, and knew things about people that people didn't know she knew. She was the wife of the largest land title broker in the county. She gave money to the church roof fund and organized the winter charity drive every year. Everyone liked her. Almost no one noticed how often her opinions happened to benefit men with money. Miriam, for her part, heard the talk the first time she drove the wagon into town for supplies. Saw the looks, caught the lowered voices at the general store, watched Hetty Bowman's smile curdle when she introduced herself. She bought her flour and her salt pork and her lamp oil. She exchanged polite words with the Harmon family, who ran the feed warehouse, and seemed genuinely decent. She made a note of who looked her in the eye and who didn't. She drove back to Frost Ridge and didn't mention any of it. Nora Hale had not spoken more than 30 words in a row since her mother died. This was not something anyone in the family said out loud, but it was something everyone knew. Before, Nora had been the loud one, opinions about everything, always narrating her own actions, always asking questions that went sideways and got longer before they got shorter. Clara had called her the family's voice, which had embarrassed Nora and secretly delighted her. After, Nora went quiet. Not sad quiet, not angry quiet, just gone quiet. As if someone had found the knob that controlled her volume and turned it down to nearly nothing. She did her work. She went to school. She sat at meals. She answered direct questions with short answers and never asked any of her own. Miriam noticed within the first week, but she didn't push. What she did instead was this. She left books in places Nora would find them. Not new books, old ones with notes in the margins from previous readers. She'd set one on the kitchen windowsill, another on the stairs, a third on the bench outside the barn where Nora sometimes sat after evening chores. She didn't say anything about them. After 4 days, Nora appeared at the kitchen doorway holding one of the books, a collection of mountain geography essays, of all things, and said, in a voice rough from disuse, "Who wrote in this one? The margins." "The woman I bought it from in Billings," Miriam said, not looking up from what she was doing. "She traveled through the Rockies twice. Her notes are better than the actual essays." Nora looked at the page, read something. "She disagrees with him here." "She does." "She's right. His math is wrong." Miriam looked up then. Something careful moved across her face before she set it aside. "Show me." Nora crossed the kitchen, sat down across the table, and showed her. It was 40 minutes before either of them noticed the time. By the end of the first month, something was happening to the house at Frost Ridge, though Gideon would have struggled to name it if anyone had asked. The meals were the most obvious change. Real meals, not just fuel. Beth ate without being coaxed. Ruth ate without already half thinking about the next thing she needed to do. Even Cody, who ate with the family on most evenings, had started complimenting the food in ways that made it clear he hadn't been doing that before because there hadn't been anything to compliment. But it was more than food. It was the sound of Nora reading something aloud to Beth at night. Not a children's book, but something with more heft to it, her voice finding its rhythm again in the dark after the lamps went down. It was Ruth sitting down at the table after supper instead of immediately getting up to do the next thing, staying for a few minutes, sometimes until the conversation lasted longer than anyone intended. It was the house breathing differently. Gideon didn't know another way to describe it. One evening he came in late from mending fence line on the south ridge, cold, tired, knuckles cut from wire, and found Miriam at the kitchen table with his account books open in front of her. He stopped. She looked up. "I wasn't prying," she said. "Ruth told me where they were. You have a note coming due January 9th. "I know when the note is due. The number doesn't work the way it's sitting," she said. "Not at current cattle prices. If you sell the roan pair by December, you make the note without touching your spring reserves. If you wait, you'll have to dip into reserves, and that puts you behind on feed costs by February." He looked at her. "You read financial ledgers for fun?" "My husband ran a small trading operation before he died. I kept the books for 7 years. She closed the ledger. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He'd been on his feet since 5 that morning. "The roan pair is good breeding stock." "They are, but you can't eat breeding stock in a hard winter." He rubbed his face with one hand. The cut on his knuckle opened again, and he pressed it against his palm without looking at it. "How'd your husband die?" he asked. A pause. "Pneumonia, 3 years ago." "Did he leave you anything?" "Debts," she said. Not bitterly, just as fact. "The trading business didn't survive him. I worked for 2 families in Billings before I came here. References are in the satchel, if you want them." "I'm not asking about references." She looked at him steadily. "Then what are you asking?" He wasn't sure. He looked down at the account book. "I'll think about the roan pair," he said. He sold them the following week. On a Saturday in November, 11 days before the first real snowfall of the season, Gideon drove into Dalton Creek for a meeting at the bank. While he was gone, Miriam took Beth and Nora to the general store for lamp oil and canning lids. Hetty Bowman was behind the counter. 2 other women were shopping, Carla De Soto and Agnes Fletcher, both of whom were pleasant to Miriam's face and whom she suspected were less pleasant when she wasn't in the room. The transaction was normal. The pleasantries were normal. It was only as Miriam was heading for the door that Hetty said, loudly enough for the whole store, and the 2 women near the fabric bolts, to hear, "Mrs. Ashcroft, I hope you're not getting too settled out at the ranch. I'd hate for those girls to get attached and then have you move on." Beth looked up. Nora's hand tightened on her package. Miriam stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She stood for a moment with her hand on the doorframe, and when she turned, her face was entirely calm. "That's a kind thought, Mrs. Bowman," she said. "I'll let the girls know you're thinking of them." She held the door open for Beth and Nora, and they walked out into the cold. They were halfway back to the wagon before Nora said quietly, "She was being mean." "Yes," Miriam said. "Why didn't you say something back?" Miriam set her packages in the wagon bed and helped Beth up onto the seat. She stood for a moment with her hand on the side rail, looking back at the store. "Because she's not worth a scene in front of her regulars," she said, "and because the best response to people who want to see you rattled is to not be rattled." Nora thought about that. "Is it hard?" Miriam climbed up and gathered the reins. "Sometimes," she said. "Yes." They rode home through the cold, the sky above them the deep layered blue that comes just before snow, and Nora sat close beside Miriam on the wagon seat without quite seeming to know she was doing it. When they got back, Ruth was on the porch. She'd been watching for them. "How was town?" she asked. "Cold," Miriam said. She handed Beth down. "Nora will tell you about it. I'm going to start supper." She went inside and the door closed behind her, and for a long moment Ruth and Nora stood looking at each other on the porch. "She all right?" Ruth asked quietly. Nora considered the question with something like new precision. "Yeah," she said. "Actually, yeah, she is." The first snow started falling that night. It came quietly, the way things do when they mean to stay. And by morning, Frost Ridge was buried under 6 inches of white, and the ridge above it was completely gone, swallowed by clouds the color of iron. Inside, the stove was already burning. Miriam had been up since 4:30. The snow that fell the first night of November didn't melt. It settled in and stayed the way hard things do, quietly, without announcement, becoming part of the landscape so gradually that after a week you stopped noticing it was there at all. The ridge above Frost Ridge Ranch disappeared behind cloud cover and didn't come back. The creek at the south boundary froze along its edges. The mornings turned brutal, the kind of cold that got inside your coat before you'd finished buttoning it, that made the horses stamp and blow and look at you like you owed them an explanation. Gideon was up before 4:30 every morning. Miriam was already in the kitchen. Neither of them ever commented on this. It became simply the arrangement, the stove going when he came downstairs, coffee made, whatever was left from the night before already warming. He'd pull on his coat and his boots while she moved around the kitchen, and they'd exchange a few words about the day's work, practical things, fence lines and feed counts and weather, and then he'd go out and she'd stay in, and that was how it ran. It was, he thought, the most efficient arrangement he'd had in years. That was the word he used when he thought about it. Efficient. He was careful not to use any other words. Ruth noticed, the way Ruth noticed everything, and she kept it to herself the way she kept most things. But Nora noticed Ruth noticing, and Beth noticed all three of them in that peripheral way small children have, absorbing the atmosphere of a room without being able to name what they're absorbing. The household had its currents and its silences, and everyone moved around both with the particular care of people who've learned that the wrong word at the wrong moment can set something delicate crashing. But the delicate things were different now. A month earlier, the thing that might break was the basic functioning of daily life. Meals, sleep, the woodpile, the endless list of what hadn't been done yet. Now those things held. The list was still long, but it was a working list instead of a drowning one. And that was the difference Gideon felt in his body before he fully understood it in his mind. He came in one Tuesday evening in late November to find Ruth sitting at the kitchen table doing nothing. Not schoolwork, not mending, not accounts, just sitting with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the middle distance, the way a person sits when their mind has finally found a moment to just be somewhere quiet. He stood in the doorway for a second, not wanting to break it. "Supper's in 20 minutes, Miriam said from behind him, coming in from the back hall. She glanced at Ruth, then at Gideon, then back at the stove. "Go wash up." He did. He didn't say anything about Ruth sitting still at the kitchen table, but later, when he was lying awake at 11 o'clock listening to the wind work at the eaves, he thought about it for a long time. His daughter had been sitting still, doing nothing, like a person who was allowed to rest. He hadn't seen that in 2 years. The realization sat in his chest in a way that was uncomfortable and necessary at the same time, like finally setting down something you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. Nora's change was slower and less obvious, which suited Nora's nature. She'd always operated below the waterline, thinking things through before they surfaced. But she was talking more, not flooding back to her old self exactly, more like someone who'd been away for a while and was remembering the rooms of a familiar house. She had opinions again. She argued at supper. She told a story one evening about something that happened at school that made Cody nearly choke on his coffee. And for one suspended moment, everybody laughed at the same time, and the sound of it was strange and full in the house, and nobody remarked on it because remarking on it might have ended it. Beth, for her part, had adopted Miriam with the uncomplicated totality that only very young children manage. She followed her, helped her, reported to her on things she observed around the ranch with an earnest precision that was sometimes useful and sometimes bewildering. "The water in the South Trough is icing faster than the North Trough," she told Miriam one morning. "I check both." Miriam looked up from the bread dough she was working. "Good. Tell your father." "I already did." "Then tell Cody to add an extra layer of straw baling around the south post." Beth's face went immediately purposeful in the way only Beth's face could. She was out the door in under a minute. Miriam went back to the dough. It was a small thing. Everything in a household was small things, but the small things were adding up to something larger, and Gideon was beginning to understand that the someone doing the adding was not him. He tried to say something about it one evening. He came close. They were sitting at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed, both of them with coffee going cold in front of them. Gideon with a land survey he'd been meaning to look at, Miriam with a letter she was writing to someone in Billings, and he said, "You've been good for them." Miriam didn't look up from the letter. "They've been good for me too." "I mean," he stopped. "I mean, it's more than what you were hired for." She set down her pen. She looked at him in the steady way she had, the way that didn't demand anything but also didn't let him off the hook. "Is that a concern?" "No." He looked down at the survey. "I just wanted to say it, that I've noticed." A silence. Then, "All right." She went back to her letter. He went back to his survey. But something had been acknowledged between them, quietly, without either of them making more of it than it was ready to be. That was how they operated. Careful and practical, taking things one degree at a time, neither of them rushing anything toward a conclusion. What neither of them was talking about was the thing that was building underneath everything else. What neither of them was talking about was what had started happening at the neighboring ranches. Miriam had noticed it first, because Miriam paid attention to things people weren't announcing. It started with a comment from Cody, who'd ridden over to the Dalton place to return a borrowed tool and come back quieter than usual. Over supper he'd said, offhand, that old Frank Dalton seemed worried about something. Not specific, just tightened up in the way a man gets when money's moving wrong. A week later, Walt Briggs, who ran the small horse operation north of town, came by to buy a length of fence wire and mentioned, also offhand, that his winter line of credit had been pulled by the Territorial Bank without much in the way of explanation. Miriam filed both of these things away. Then she drove into town on a Thursday for supplies and stopped at the post office, where she fell into conversation with Eleanor Voss, whose husband ran the Voss cattle operation 6 miles east. Eleanor was a careful woman, not a gossip, so when she mentioned that 2 of their prize bulls had died in September, under what the vet described as unusual circumstances, Miriam listened with particular attention. "What did the vet say exactly?" Miriam asked. "He said it looked like something they ate. But we've ranched that same pasture for 11 years. Eleanor's voice was controlled, but her hands weren't. She was folding and unfolding the corner of her coat with one finger. Carl checked everything. The grass, the water, the other feed. Nothing wrong with any of it. "Did he report it to anyone?" Eleanor gave her a look. "Who would we report it to?" Miriam drove home and sat with what she knew for a while before she started arranging it. She wasn't the kind of person who jumped to conclusions. She'd learned, in the years of managing her late husband's accounts and tracking where money went and why it moved the way it did, that conclusions made too quickly were usually wrong in ways that mattered. What you did instead was collect. You collected until the picture had enough in it to be read clearly. So she started collecting. She began asking questions when she had reason to be in town, not probing questions, just the natural extension of conversations that were already happening, things people brought up themselves when given room to talk. She listened to what the ranching families mentioned and what they didn't mention. She listened to what the people in town mentioned about the ranching families. She read every issue of the Dalton Creek Courier that made it out to the ranch, working through the property transfer notices in the back pages with the same focused attention she'd once given to shipping manifests. The property transfer notices were interesting. In the past 18 months, 7 ranching operations in the county had changed hands. Not unusual in itself. Ranching was hard and people sold out for all kinds of reasons. But 5 of those 7 had sold to the same entity, a land-holding company called Crow Basin Properties, registered out of the territorial capital. The purchase prices, where she could find them noted in the public record, were low. Not borderline low. Significantly low. The kind of low that meant the seller had been in a position where they couldn't wait for a better offer. She sat with this for 2 weeks. Then the Henshaw fire happened. The Henshaw operation was 8 miles west, a small family ranch, just Pete Henshaw and his wife and their son, running about 40 head. The fire took the main barn on a clear, windless night in early December. No lightning, no stove malfunction that Pete could explain. The barn was simply gone by morning, and with it a winter's worth of stored hay and 3 horses. Miriam heard about it from Cody, who heard it from the farmhand at the Fletcher place, who'd seen the smoke from a distance. She drove over that afternoon with food and didn't say much, just helped Mrs. Henshaw get sorted and listened while Pete talked about it in the way men talk about catastrophe when they haven't slept. Circular and not quite landing. "Insurance?" she asked at a quiet moment. Pete's laugh had no humor in it. "Dropped it in October, couldn't make the premium. Did you try to renegotiate?" "I tried. They said no." She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, with her notebooks and her newspaper clippings and her property transfer records spread in front of her, and for the first time she let herself look at the whole picture instead of the individual pieces. The livestock deaths happened first. Then the financial pressure. Credit pulled, premiums raised, notes called in early. Then the accidents. Then the sale, always to Crow Basin Properties, always at a price that suggested the seller had run out of options. It was patient. Whoever was running it was patient and careful, and had access to enough legal and financial mechanisms to make each individual piece look like ordinary misfortune. Miriam stared at the papers for a long time. Then she looked up at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection in the dark glass, and she thought about the Frost Ridge account books, the note due in January, the line of credit that had seemed solid but was held by the same territorial bank that had dropped Walt Briggs without explanation. She thought about Gideon's face when he came in from mending fence in the cold, already stretched thin, carrying more than a person should carry alone. She closed the notebooks. She put everything away carefully. She banked the stove for the night. She was not ready to say anything yet. Not to Gideon, not to anyone. Because saying it out loud before she could back it up with something solid was the same as saying nothing. It would either be dismissed or it would cause panic, and neither of those helped anybody. But she knew now. She knew what she was looking at. The man behind Crow Basin Properties wasn't hard to find once you knew to look. Magnus Crow was not unknown in the territory. He simply hadn't been relevant to Dalton Creek before, operating primarily out of the capital and the larger towns further east. He was 61, according to what she found in the territorial business filings. Self-made, which in this era and this part of the country could mean many things. Owned significant mineral interests in addition to the land holdings. Contributed generously to several political campaigns, which was noted in the papers in the complimentary language reserved for men who give money to things. He was, in other words, the kind of man who could apply pressure through institutions without ever putting his own hands on anything. She needed to understand his local piece, because something this systematic, operating across this many ranches over this many months, required someone on the ground. Someone in Dalton Creek who was positioned to know which operations were struggling, which men were most likely to break under pressure, which relationships to manage. She went looking for that piece and found it before she was entirely ready to. It was Evelyn Mercer. Not through any single dramatic revelation, but through accumulation, the same way everything else had become clear. Miriam had been watching Evelyn since the first conversation at the general store, the way you watch someone who's made it clear they've already judged you. She'd watched Evelyn at the 2 community gatherings she'd attended with Gideon. She'd noticed who Evelyn talked to, and for how long, and what those people did afterward. Robert Mercer, Evelyn's husband, ran the county's largest land title brokerage. He handled almost every property transfer in the region. He was pleasant, unremarkable, and completely overshadowed by his wife in every social context. Whether he was aware of what was moving through his brokerage was a question Miriam couldn't yet answer. What she could see was Evelyn. Evelyn, who knew everyone's financial position through the overlapping web of charity work and church committees and social calls. Evelyn, who was one of the first people to offer sympathy when a ranch family announced a hardship, and one of the first people to connect them with resources. Resources that, if you looked carefully, tended to compound the problem rather than solve it. A moneylender here, a new insurance broker there, an introduction to a bank officer who turned out to be inflexible, and Evelyn, who had specifically targeted Miriam with her comments almost from the first week. Not because she knew Miriam specifically, but because Miriam had arrived at Frost Ridge at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on where you were standing. And anything that stabilized the Hale household was a complication to a plan that was already in motion. Miriam understood this the way you understand something that you've been moving toward for weeks without quite knowing you were moving. And once she understood it, She also understood that the attacks on Frost Ridge hadn't started yet because they hadn't needed to. The ranch was already weakening on its own. The note in January, the aging equipment, the depleted crew. Gideon was already under pressure. All Crow's operation needed to do was wait for him to buckle under his own weight, then apply the final push, unless something changed the weight. She was thinking about all of this on a cold December afternoon, when she heard the sound she'd been halfway dreading. The thud of hooves coming in fast from the road, not the easy canter of someone on an ordinary errand. She was out the back door before the rider had cleared the gate. It was Eddie Voss, Eleanor's 17-year-old son. His horse was lathered, and his face was the color of old ash. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he pulled up. "Is Mr. Hale here? He's on the North Ridge. What happened?" Eddie swallowed. "Dad sent me. 3 of our cattle. The ones in the east pasture. We found them this morning. They're dead, all 3. And Dad found something by the water line." He stopped. "Somebody cut the pipe. Not broke it, cut it, and ran something into the line upstream." The cold settled into Miriam's hands. She kept her face even. "Did your father send for the sheriff?" "He's scared to." Eddie's voice cracked on the last word. He was 17 and trying not to be. "He says if he makes noise, whoever did it will come back and finish what they started." Miriam looked at him steadily. "Go around to the barn. Cody will take care of your horse. I'll send someone up for Gideon." She sent Beth, who was fast and knew the North Ridge path better than anyone. She brought Eddie inside and gave him coffee, and didn't ask him anything else until his hands had stopped shaking. When Gideon came in, his face already dark from whatever Beth had managed to convey on the run-up, Miriam met him in the hallway before he reached the kitchen. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough." She kept her voice low. 3-head, poisoned water line, deliberate cut. Same pattern as what happened to the Henshaw barn in the Dalton credit pull and the Voss bulls in September. He stared at her. "You think they're connected?" "I know they're connected." She said it quietly, without drama. "I've been watching it for 6 weeks. I need you to listen to me, Gideon, and I need you to not dismiss this because it sounds like too large a thing to be true." Something moved in his expression. Doubt, and then the particular kind of attention that comes when someone says something that clicks against a thing you've been half knowing for a while. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She did it in the kitchen, with Eddie sitting at the table and Cody standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, laying it out the same way she'd laid it out to herself over 6 weeks of careful collection. The property transfers. The prices. Crow Basin properties. The pattern of pressure that preceded each sale. The livestock, the credit, the accidents, the insurance. Magnus Crow. And Evelyn Mercer's position at the center of local information. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. Cody let out a long breath through his nose. Eddie was looking at the table. Gideon was looking at Miriam. His jaw was set hard, and his eyes had gone to a place behind the anger, the place where a man goes when he's forcing himself to think instead of react. "You said you've been watching this for 6 weeks, he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because 6 weeks ago I didn't have enough to show you anything but a theory. Now I do." She met his eyes. "And because you had enough on your mind." He didn't like that answer, and she could tell he didn't like it. But he also didn't argue with it, because he knew she was right about what 6 weeks ago would have looked like. Him half-present, overworked, carrying the ranch on a fraying rope. A theory then would have gone nowhere. "What do we do?" Cody asked. Miriam pulled one of her notebooks across the table. "We don't do anything alone, and we don't do anything loud until we're ready. If Crow knows we're looking at him before we have what we need, the paper trail gets cleaned up and the witnesses get scared." She looked at Gideon. "But we're going to need the other ranchers, the ones who've already lost something and the ones who haven't yet, because what I have alone isn't enough. What all of us have together might be." Gideon looked at the notebook. He looked at Eddie, who was watching him with the face of a boy who'd ridden hard to the one place he thought might help. "My dad trusted you," Eddie said to Gideon. Then, after a pause to Miriam, he said, "Mrs. Ashcroft seems like someone who pays attention." The fire in the stove popped. Wind moved at the windows. Gideon put his hand flat on the table. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" It wasn't agreement to a full plan. They didn't have a full plan yet, but it was the beginning of one, and sometimes the beginning was enough to work with. Miriam nodded and opened the notebook, and the four of them sat around the kitchen table while the December dark came down outside, and started to figure out what they were going to do about the man who was quietly swallowing the valley whole. Ruth came downstairs at some point and stood in the doorway long enough to understand the general shape of the conversation. She didn't leave. She went and got herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the end of the table without being invited, and nobody told her to go to bed, because nobody around that table had the heart to suggest that the girl who'd been holding this family together for 2 years didn't have the right to sit in on a conversation about whether the family would have a home. Outside, the snow was coming down again, heavier this time, the kind that changed the landscape by morning. Inside the kitchen at Frost Ridge, 5 people sat with the truth of what was coming toward them, and nobody pretended it was going to be simple, and nobody pretended it was going to be fine. They just sat with it together, which was different from sitting with it alone, and in the difference was the first fragile thread of something that might eventually grow into a way through. The first meeting happened in the Voss barn, 3 days after Eddie's hard ride to Frost Ridge. Carl Voss had cleared a space between the hay bales and set up lanterns along the center post, and by 8 o'clock that evening there were 11 people standing in the cold light. Gideon, Cody, Carl, and Eleanor Voss, Pete Henshaw and his wife Doris, Frank Dalton and his son-in-law Walt Briggs, the Harmon brothers from the feed warehouse, who had their own quiet concerns about what they'd been seeing in the county's commerce patterns, and Miriam. She was the only woman there besides Eleanor and Doris, and when she set her notebooks on the hay bale they were using as a table, she caught the brief exchange of glances between Frank Dalton and Walt Briggs. Not hostile exactly, more like adjustment, the particular recalibration men do when a situation isn't arranged the way they expected. She let it settle and didn't address it. The work would address it. She'd laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Gideon, methodically, starting with the property transfers and working forward through the pattern of pressure, the livestock losses, the pulled credit lines, the insurance complications, the fires, and the water contamination. She had the names of the purchased properties, the purchase dates, the recorded prices. She had the Crow Basin Properties filings. She had her notes from every conversation she'd had over the past 6 weeks, organized and cross-referenced. When she finished, the barn was quiet enough that you could hear the horses shifting in their stalls at the far end. Pete Henshaw said, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it when the insurance dropped me. I just didn't think—" He stopped. "I didn't think it was connected." "None of us thought it was connected," Carl said. "That's the point of it. Each piece looks like ordinary bad luck." "So what do we do?" Frank Dalton asked. He was looking at Miriam. Whatever adjustment he'd needed to make, he'd made it. "We build a case," Miriam said. "Every financial document you still have, notices from the bank, correspondence about credit, insurance cancellation letters, anything with a date on it. Every dead animal that was unusual, write down what the vet said and when. Every incident you reported to anyone and their response or lack of it. We compile everything together, and we look for the connections we can prove rather than the ones we only suspect." "And then?" Walt Briggs asked. "Then we find someone we can take it to." "The sheriff's in the county seat," Gideon said, "and he's appointed, not elected." The implication hung in the air. An appointed sheriff in a territory where Magnus Crow had contributed generously to political campaigns was not necessarily a safe destination for this kind of complaint. "There's a territorial land commissioner," one of the Harmon brothers said, "based in Helena, independent of county structure." "I know of him," Miriam said. "I've been thinking about that route." She paused. "But we need to be certain before we go anywhere official. If we file a complaint that doesn't hold, it gives Crow's people time to cover what's left." Nobody argued with that. They met twice more over the following 10 days, rotating between the Voss barn and the back room of the Harmon warehouse in town. Each time, more documents arrived: bank notices, vet reports, a handwritten account from Doris Henshaw of every conversation she'd had with their insurance broker before the policy was dropped, including 2 specific sentences she'd written down the same evening because something about them had felt wrong. Old Frank Dalton brought a ledger going back 4 years that showed how his line of credit had been incrementally reduced in the year before it was finally pulled, always by small enough amounts that he'd chalked each reduction up to routine adjustment. Miriam organized everything. She cross-referenced dates, She found 3 instances where a financial pressure on one ranch had followed within 2 weeks of a visit from Robert Mercer's brokerage office. Not proof of Evelyn's involvement, but a thread worth pulling. Gideon watched her work and didn't fully have a word for what he was watching. She wasn't strategic in the cold, mechanical sense. She was something more like relentless, the kind of steady, grinding focus that doesn't announce itself or ask for recognition, that simply continues until the thing is done. He'd seen it in the way she ran the house, but this was the same quality at a different scale, and it unsettled him the way competence sometimes does when you encounter it in a form you weren't expecting. He said something about it one night, driving back from the Voss place in the dark with snow coming down sideways off the ridge. Just the two of them in the wagon, wrapped in whatever layers they'd been able to pile on. He said, "You don't have to be the one doing all of this." She didn't answer right away. "Who else is doing it? We could share it out, give some of the organizing to Carl or the Harmons. Carl's managing his operation with 3 hands and a bad knee. The Harmons are trying not to lose their business contract with the supply route." She pulled her coat tighter. "I have time that they don't have. That's all this is." "It's not all it is." Another pause. The horse's hooves on the frozen road, the wind, the snow hitting the wagon cover. "Gideon," her voice was even, "don't make it larger than it is. I'm good at organizing information, and I have reason to care what happens to your ranch. That's enough reason." He let it go. But he thought about that phrase, reason to care what happens to your ranch, for the next 3 days, turning it over, checking it from different angles the way you check a tool that might have a crack in it you haven't found yet. Then January came, and the attacks began. The first was the credit line. On January 3rd, Gideon received a formal notice from the Territorial Savings and Loan that his operating line of credit was being reduced by 40% effective immediately, due to a revised assessment of collateral value. The letter was signed by a bank officer he'd never met and cited a property appraisal that had apparently been conducted without his knowledge sometime in November. He sat at the kitchen table reading the letter twice. Then he set it down. "It's starting," Miriam said. She was standing at the counter and hadn't read the letter. She'd read his face. 40%. Which puts January's note in jeopardy. Yes. She turned back to the counter. She didn't say "I told you it was coming," because there was no point in that, and she didn't pretend the situation wasn't serious because they were past the point of pretending. "What's your float if you pull from spring reserves?" "Thin. If we have a hard calving season or lose any head, we won't touch the spring reserves," she said. "Give me 2 days." He didn't ask for what. He'd learned over the past weeks that Miriam moved differently than he did. She went quiet before she went anywhere, worked the problem in her head until she had something worth saying, and then said it. Pushing her to talk before she was ready produced nothing useful. 2 days later, she came to him with a revised budget, reduced household expenditures, a specific proposal to renegotiate the hay supply contract with the Harmons, and a handwritten letter to his bank officer requesting a meeting to dispute the appraisal on procedural grounds, citing 3 specific clauses in the original credit agreement that she'd apparently memorized. "The letter buys us time," she said. "Institutions hate procedural disputes because they generate paperwork. They'll delay the enforcement while they respond to it." "How long?" 30 to 60 days, maybe more if they're understaffed, which territorial banks usually are in January. Gideon sent the letter. 8 days later, 4 head of prize cattle were found dead in the east pasture. The vet, a careful man named Aldous Webb, who'd been working the county for 20 years and had seen most things, took one look at the symptoms and told Gideon privately that it wasn't any disease he recognized, and that the pattern was consistent with a specific plant toxin that didn't grow anywhere on Frost Ridge's land. "Someone would have had to bring it in," Webb said. He kept his voice low, though there was no one around to hear. "Deliberately introduced into the feed." Gideon held himself very still. "Can you put that in writing?" Webb looked uncomfortable. "I can note the cause of death as undetermined toxic ingestion. I can't prove deliberate introduction without—" "The written record is enough," Gideon said. "I'm not asking you to testify to anything you can't prove. I'm asking you to write down what you observed." Webb did. Miriam added it to the file. The water line at the south boundary was next. It happened on a night when the temperature dropped to 15 below and the ground was iron hard, which meant whoever had done it had planned the timing. Because in ground that frozen, the damage would take days to access and repair, and the cattle in the south paddock would be without water and killing cold. Cody found it at 5 in the morning when he went to check the trough and found it dry and a skin of ice forming across the mud where the water should have been running. Gideon and Cody worked in the dark with lanterns to route a temporary line from the well pump, hands bleeding from the cold by the time they got water flowing again. They lost 2 calves overnight. Gideon couldn't say for certain the water situation had killed them. They were young. It was viciously cold. There were other factors, but they were gone, and the ranch absorbed the loss the way it absorbed everything now, silently and at cost. Miriam documented it. She also walked the length of the south water line herself the next morning, following it to the point of deliberate damage, and she noticed something Gideon and Cody hadn't had time to notice in the dark and cold. A set of boot prints in the ice-crusted mud beside the cut pipe, and beside those prints, the distinctive triangular imprint of a wagon wheel, close enough to the fence line that whoever had made it had come in from the county road rather than across the open range. She didn't touch anything. She stood there in the cold, looking at it for a long time, and then she went back to the house and sketched what she'd seen, with the kind of precision that comes from years of recording cargo manifests where every detail had financial consequence. She sent Eddie Voss to get Carl Voss, and Carl came and looked at the prints too, and confirmed that the wheel pattern matched a particular style of iron tire that the livery stable in Dalton Creek had fitted on one of their rental rigs 6 weeks ago. He knew because he'd been there the same day, watching them do it, and had admired the work. The livery stable in Dalton Creek kept rental records. Those records were not private. Anyone could ask to see them. The question was whether anyone had reason to ask, and whether the person who kept them would cooperate. Miriam had met the livery owner, a taciturn man named Joe Pemberton, twice at the feed store. She'd formed a moderate opinion of him, not dishonest, not brave, the kind of man who stayed out of trouble as a matter of policy. She went to see him on her own without telling Gideon. This was, she would later acknowledge, the decision she was least sure about. Gideon wouldn't have stopped her, but he would have come with her, and she needed the conversation to be simple. A woman asking quiet questions alone was less threatening than a man, and a woman asking the same questions together. That was simply how it worked, and she was practical enough to use it. She bought a small piece of harness hardware she didn't particularly need, and mentioned, as if it had just come to mind, that she thought she'd seen one of the livery rigs out near the South County Road around the first week of January. "I was driving back from the Voss place late," she said. "Odd time to have a rig out that way." Joe Pemberton's hands slowed on the counter slightly. "Do you remember who had a rig out that week?" she asked. Conversational, looking at the hardware in her hand. "I don't usually keep track of where people go," he said. "No, of course not." She put the hardware down and picked up a second piece. "I just thought if it was someone I knew, I might have a word with them. It seemed like the rig might have gone off-road a little. Didn't want them to have damaged it without reporting it." She could see him working it out. The logic of what she was saying, the cover story she was offering him, the interpretation that made this a mundane matter of equipment responsibility rather than anything darker. "Week of January 5th, he said finally. "Around then." He looked at her for a moment, deciding something. "I'd have to check my log." "I understand." She set down the hardware. "I'll take this piece. Whatever you find in your log, if it saves someone embarrassment, maybe it's better just to note it down somewhere rather than make a formal thing of it." She paid for the hardware and left. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at Frost Ridge with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from a rental log, noting that a 2-horse enclosed rig had been rented the evening of January 7th by a man named Donahue. Cash payment, returned the following morning with 67 miles on it and a notation about mud on the left wheel rim. Miriam didn't know the name Donahue, but the Harmon brothers did. He was a laborer who drifted into the county the previous spring and done periodic work at the Mercer property. She sat with this for a full day. Then she brought it to Gideon. He read the page twice, and when he looked up, his expression was the particular kind of controlled that meant the thing underneath it was not controlled at all. "How did you get this?" he asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "You went to Pemberton alone?" "Yes." "Without Gideon." She met his eyes. "Would you have done it differently?" He wanted to say yes. She could see him wanting to say yes, the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was choosing his words with care. "It could have gone wrong," he said finally. Most things could go wrong. That's not a reason not to do them. He looked at the log page again. Donahue. He worked at the Mercer property. Another silence, longer this time. The kitchen was cold enough that their breath showed faintly. It's still not proof, he said. A man renting a rig and having mud on the wheel doesn't prove— No, she agreed, but it's another thread, and threads connect to other threads if you follow them long enough. She took the page back carefully. We're close, Gideon, but we need more time. The barn fire came before they had it. It started on a Thursday evening in the last week of January, and it started fast, too fast, Cody said afterward, in the way of things that have help getting started. The main barn at Frost Ridge, the one that had stood for 22 years, the one Gideon's father had built with his own hands, and 2 hired men, went up as if it had been wanting to burn for years. Gideon saw the glow from his bedroom window at 11 at night and was down the stairs and out the door before he was fully awake. Cody came from the bunkhouse at a dead run. Ruth appeared on the porch and Miriam was already there, already moving. They got the horses out. That was the thing that mattered most, and they managed it. 3 horses and a mule, pulled from their stalls with blankets over their eyes, led out into the snow while the structure above them groaned and the heat came off the walls like a physical blow. Gideon went back in twice, and the second time a burning rafter came down close enough to his shoulder that it took a strip of his coat, and Cody grabbed him by the collar and physically hauled him back out. "There's nothing else alive in there," Cody shouted over the noise of the fire. "There's nothing else. The tack room. It's gone, boss. It's gone." They stood in the yard in the snow and the cold and watched it burn. There was nothing to do but watch. Dalton Creek's volunteer bucket brigade arrived an hour later and managed to wet down the outbuildings and keep the fire from spreading, but the barn itself was a total loss before they arrived. In the morning, what remained was a black skeleton against a white sky, the smell of it hanging over the whole property in a way that would persist for weeks. The horses were in the paddock under a canvas lean-to Gideon and Cody had erected at 2 in the morning. The stored winter hay, the tack, the equipment that had been inside— gone. Gideon stood looking at it in the gray morning light. He hadn't slept. His coat was burned at one shoulder and he hadn't changed it. He stood there long enough that his feet went numb and he didn't notice. Miriam came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything about the barn. There was nothing useful to say about the barn. After a while she said, "The fire investigator from the county comes through on Tuesdays. He's based in Millhaven. I'll send a wire today." Gideon said nothing. "Carl Voss will come with hay by this afternoon. He won't wait to be asked." Still nothing. "Gideon?" Her voice was quiet but firm. "I need you to look at me." He turned his head. He looked terrible, and she didn't pretend otherwise. There were ash marks on his face, and his eyes had the flat quality of a man who spent a night past the point where he can feel things properly. "They want you to stand here and feel like this," she said. "That's the point of it. They want you to stand here and feel like there's no way through." His jaw moved. "There might not be." "There is." She said it without flinching, without offering him comfort that wasn't true. "It doesn't look like one from here. But it exists, and we've been building toward it for 6 weeks, and a burned barn is not the end of it unless you let it be." He looked back at the wreckage. "I don't know if I can do this," he said. It was the first time she'd heard him say that about anything, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "That's new. Use it." Carl Voss arrived with hay at 2 that afternoon, as she'd predicted. Walt Briggs came with him, along with 2 of his hands, and they worked through the afternoon setting up a temporary shelter and getting the horses properly sorted. Pete Henshaw came the following morning with lumber. Not enough to build a barn, but enough to start framing a temporary structure that would get them through the worst of winter. The county fire investigator came on Tuesday. His name was T-Bolt, and he was thorough and unhurried and came to his conclusions without editorializing. In his written report, filed 4 days later, he noted that the fire had originated in 2 separate points simultaneously, the northwest corner near the hayloft access and the tack room door, and that the accelerant patterns were consistent with deliberate ignition. It was, in the clean language of official documentation, arson. Miriam added the report to the file and sat with what they now had. She spread everything across the kitchen table one evening after the girls were in bed and Gideon and Cody were sitting across from her, and went through it piece by piece. The property transfer records and the Crow Basin filings, the vet reports from the Voss Ranch and from Frost Ridge, the financial notices with their suspicious timing, Doris Henshaw's handwritten account, the rental log page, the fire investigation report, her own sketched notes from the water line, the collected testimony of 11 ranching families who had each experienced some version of the same sequence. It was substantial. It was, she thought, enough not to guarantee an outcome, but enough to demand one be considered. But she kept coming back to one problem, which was the same problem it had always been. Every piece of evidence pointed at a pattern. The pattern pointed at Crow Basin properties. But the connection between Crow Basin properties and the specific acts, the poisoned feed, the cut water line, the fire, ran through people like Donahue, who could plausibly claim to have been acting independently. And the connection between Evelyn Mercer and the financial coordination was a thread of timing and association that a good lawyer could pull apart. What they needed was someone who knew how the structure worked from the inside. She'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, turning it over at night when everything else was quiet. She'd made a short list of people who might have that knowledge. People who had worked for Crow's operation and subsequently stopped, or people whose positions would have given them access to the internal arrangements. One name kept coming to the top of the list, Arthur Klein, former land agent for Crow Basin Properties, who had apparently left the company's employ in October under circumstances that the territorial business filings described only as a change in organizational structure. He was, according to the Harmon brothers, currently living in the county seat, working a clerical job at a shipping office, and reportedly not in good health. Miriam had no way to know what Klein knew or whether he would talk. She had no leverage over him and no personal connection to him. What she had was the same thing she'd been using throughout: the ability to walk into a room and listen carefully and give a person room to say the thing they'd been carrying. She told Gideon about Klein on a Wednesday evening. He listened. "It's risky," he said. "If he's still loyal to Crow, or if he tells them we're looking." "I know. Everything we've built. I know." She looked at him. "But we've reached the edge of what we can find from the outside. We need someone who was on the inside, or we go to the commissioner with what we have and take the chance that it's enough. Those are the two options." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you go to Klein, I'm coming with you." She didn't argue. They went on a Friday, leaving before first light so as to reach the county seat by mid-morning. The drive was cold and long, and they didn't talk much, which had become a particular kind of comfortable between them. Not silence born of distance, but silence born of people who'd gotten used to each other's presence without needing to fill every moment with words. The shipping office where Klein worked was a narrow building on the main commercial street of the county seat. They found him at a desk in the back, a man in his late 40s who had the look of someone recently reduced, good coat wearing thin at the elbows, careful movements, eyes that moved to the door when they came in and stayed alert. "Mr. Klein," Miriam said, "my name is Miriam Ashcroft. This is Gideon Hale. We're from Dalton Creek." Something shifted in his face at the name of the town. Not surprise, more like the particular expression of someone hearing a word they'd been half expecting. "I figured someone from out that way would come eventually," he said. His voice was flat, not unwelcoming, just tired in a particular way. "Sit down if you want." They sat. The shipping clerk at the front desk was occupied with something noisy enough to serve as privacy. Gideon started to speak, but Miriam put her hand briefly on his arm. He stopped. She looked at Klein steadily. "I'm not going to tell you what we know and ask you to confirm it," she said. "I'm going to ask you instead to tell me what happened to make you leave Crow Basin in October." Klein looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said. "Because I think you left for a reason," she said. "And I think the reason is still sitting with you." Outside, the wind was running hard down the main street, pushing a skin of ice crystals against the window glass. Klein looked at the window. He looked at his hands on the desk. He looked at Gideon, then back at Miriam. "They told me what the Henshaw fire was for," he said quietly. "Not as a warning, just told me. Like it was nothing, like it was a line item." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Pete Henshaw's got a kid. He's got a little boy about 8 years old, and they told me about the fire like it was a line item." The room was very quiet. "I packed my things that afternoon," he said. "I didn't know what I was going to do. I still don't know what I'm going to do. He looked at Miriam. But I've been keeping records since March. Everything I could document without taking files that weren't mine. Dates, conversations, instructions, who gave them. A pause. I didn't know if I'd ever use them, but I kept them. Miriam said very carefully, "Would you be willing to show them to us?" Klein looked at the window again. He looked like a man making a decision he'd been avoiding for months, and the weight of it showed in every line of his face. "What happens after?" he said. "We take everything to the Territorial Land Commissioner," Miriam said, "publicly, at the spring livestock auction in Millhaven. Every ranching family in the territory will be there. Magnus Crow will be there." Klein's expression shifted. "That's a very large risk." "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Another long silence. The wind against the glass. The clerk in the front of the office shuffling papers. "If I do this," Klein said slowly, "and it doesn't work, then we lose," Gideon said. He said it without softening it, because Klein deserved the honest version. "We lose the ranches, and we lose the case, and probably the territory becomes unlivable for everyone who was involved. That's the truth of it." Klein looked at him, then at Miriam. "And if it does work?" he asked. Miriam held his gaze. "Then Pete Henshaw's son grows up on his family's land," she said, "and so do a lot of other children." It was not a grand promise. It was not a guarantee. It was simply the truth of what was at stake, said plainly, without decoration. Arthur Klein sat at his desk in a thin county seat shipping office with the wind outside, and he thought about a line item on a page that was really a family's barn, and he came to the decision he'd been building toward since October. "All right," he said, "let me get my coat." Arthur Klein's records were kept in a leather satchel under the floorboards of his rented room above the shipping office, a detail that told Miriam everything she needed to know about how frightened he'd been since October. He retrieved the satchel while they waited downstairs, and when he set it on the desk and opened it, Gideon leaned forward slightly without meaning to. The contents were meticulous. Klein had the careful, small handwriting of someone who'd spent years reducing large transactions to compact notations. Dates in the left margin, parties involved in the center, outcomes and instructions on the right. 12 pages of it, front and back, covering 8 months of Crow Basin's operations in the Dalton Creek County territory. Miriam didn't read it there. She looked at enough to understand the structure, asked Klein 3 specific questions about the notation system, and then asked if she could take it. He hesitated. "That's the only copy. I'll copy it tonight and return it to you by tomorrow afternoon. You keep the original." She looked at him steadily. "You've held on to this for 4 months. Let me hold it for 24 hours. He agreed. She thought he was mostly relieved to share the weight of it with someone else. They drove back to Dalton Creek in the afternoon light, which in January lasted about as long as it took to put your coat on. Gideon held the reins and Miriam held the satchel in her lap, and neither of them spoke much for the first hour. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what they'd just done had a particular gravity to it that required a few miles of quiet to settle. Eventually Gideon said, "He's scared." "He should be. He knows what they're capable of." "What happens to him if this doesn't work?" "We make sure it works," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "That's not an answer." "I know." She looked straight ahead at the road, the horse's breath pluming white in the cold. "I don't have a better one." He knew that when he said yes. Back at Frost Ridge, she sat at the kitchen table until past midnight with a stack of paper and a good pen and copied every line of Arthur Klein's records by hand. She wrote fast and precisely, the way she'd copied manifests and ledgers for 7 years, not letting herself think too far ahead into what the words meant, just getting them down accurately. When she finished, she checked her copy against the original twice and then sat back and let herself read it as a whole document for the first time. It was worse than she had expected, which was saying something. The record showed not just a pattern of pressure, but a coordinated operation with clearly delineated roles. Crow Basin had a man they called the assessor, not Donahue, a different person, unnamed in the records but described by function, whose job was to evaluate each target ranch's specific vulnerabilities and identify the sequence of pressures most likely to produce a quick capitulation. The assessor had produced written recommendations for at least 6 of the Dalton Creek ranches. Klein had been present for 2 of those meetings and had noted the key points from memory immediately afterward. Robert Mercer's brokerage appeared 4 times in the records, always in connection with the transfer of a distressed property. Whether Robert himself was aware of the arrangement or simply processing paperwork that moved through his office was still unclear, but his name was there, and that was enough to compel an investigation. Evelyn Mercer appeared once, identified only as the local correspondent. The notation beside her name was brief. Coordinates community information identifies resistance points. Klein had written it down 3 months ago in the compact language of someone recording facts, not making judgments, but the meaning was plain. Evelyn knew which families were struggling and which were likely to push back, and she fed that information up the chain. Miriam sat with this for a long time. She'd been right about Evelyn, and being right about it didn't feel like anything except heavy. She returned the original satchel to Klein the next afternoon, as promised. On the drive back, she stopped at the Voss farm and told Carl what they had. Carl sat with his hands flat on his knees for a moment after she finished and said, "When do we move?" "The spring livestock auction in Mill Haven, March 15th. That's 6 weeks. 6 weeks to get everyone prepared. Every ranching family that's been affected needs to be there and needs to know their part." She paused. "And we need to keep it quiet until we're standing in front of that crowd. If word gets to Crow beforehand, he'll either run or he'll come for the people involved in a way we can't manage." Carl nodded slowly. "What about the commissioner?" "I've drafted a formal complaint. I'll file it the week before the auction, late enough that the response won't arrive before we've made the public disclosure, early enough that his office is already aware when we stand up and speak." She'd thought about the timing carefully, working backward from the auction date over several evenings with a calendar on the table in front of her. Once the complaint is filed and the public disclosure is made at the same time, the story becomes too large to suppress. That's the theory. What's the risk in the theory? "That we're wrong about the size of it," she said. "That Crow has more reach in the commissioner's office than we know, that one of the families breaks early and word gets out." She didn't dress it up. "There's real risk. I won't pretend otherwise." Carl was quiet for a moment. "My wife says we were already out of options before you started looking at this." "Eleanor is right. Then we don't have anything to lose by trying." He stood up, and the particular way he did it, straight, deliberate, told her his bad knee was hurting and he was deciding not to let it matter. "Tell me what you need from me." What she needed from him was what she needed from all of them: patience and discretion and the ability to keep going through a cold February without visible hope, which was harder than it sounded when you were running an operation on damaged infrastructure and reduced credit and the permanent background knowledge that someone was waiting for you to break. February was the worst month. The attacks on Frost Ridge paused, which should have felt like relief, and instead felt like the particular kind of dread that comes when you know something is coming and you don't know from which direction. Gideon moved through the ranch days with a tightness around his eyes that didn't fully leave even in the evenings, and Cody, who was not a naturally quiet person, had taken on a careful, watchful quality that made him seem older than 23. The girls knew something was in motion. Miriam hadn't told them the full picture. They were children, and the specifics would only frighten them in ways that didn't help. But they weren't naive, and the atmosphere of a household where the adults are holding something big and difficult to manage tends to transmit itself without words. Ruth had gone back into her quiet, operational mode, making herself useful in ways that were clearly also a way of managing her own worry. Nora had started writing things down in a notebook. Not the geographical essays she'd been reading, but her own observations, spare and precise, which Miriam recognized as a way of imposing order on a situation that felt disordered. Beth, who was 7 and therefore the most direct person in the house, said one evening at supper, "Are we going to lose the ranch?" The table went quiet. Gideon opened his mouth, and Miriam could see him reaching for something that was both honest and manageable for a 7-year-old, and not quite finding it quickly enough. "We're working hard to make sure we don't," Miriam said. "That's true. And the work is going well." Beth looked at her with the unnerving directness she'd always had. "But you don't know for sure." "No," Miriam said. "I don't know for sure." Beth considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her supper. Ruth caught Miriam's eye across the table. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the particular difficulty of telling children the truth in the right proportion. which was one of the harder things adults had to manage, and one that didn't get easier with practice. The preparation work continued in the margins of everything else. Miriam met with the affected families in pairs and threes, never large groups that might attract notice, going over what each person would say and when. She helped them organize their own documents, coached them on presenting complex financial grievances in plain language to an audience of ranchers who understood hard work and weather, but not necessarily the mechanics of corporate land acquisition. She also spent 2 evenings working with Gideon specifically on how he would present the case, because Gideon needed to be the one to speak first, publicly. He was from Dalton Creek. He was known. The other ranchers trusted him in a way they would take longer to extend to an outside woman, and that was simply a fact to be worked with rather than argued against. The coaching was sometimes uncomfortable. Gideon was not a natural public speaker. He tended to go technical when he was nervous, reaching for numbers and specifics when what an audience needed first was the human shape of the thing. Miriam would stop him mid-practice and say, "You're telling them the ledger. Tell them what it meant to stand in your yard and watch the barn your father built burn down." That's... He stopped, started again. "That feels like asking for sympathy?" "Yes." "It's not," she said. "It's telling the truth. The ledger is also the truth, but it's the truth after the other truth, not before it. People need to feel the weight of the thing before they can understand the numbers." He practiced. He got better. Not smooth. Miriam would have been suspicious of smooth because smooth read is rehearsed and rehearsed read is managed, and what they needed was real. But he got clearer, and clearer was enough. Arthur Klein came to Frost Ridge twice in February, making the drive quietly and without announcement. He and Miriam worked through his records in detail, identifying the 3 or 4 specific pieces of documentation that were most unambiguous, the ones that would be hardest to explain away as coincidence or misinterpretation. She was calibrating for a public audience, not a courtroom, and the standards were different. A courtroom required proof beyond reasonable doubt. A room full of ranchers at a livestock auction required enough evidence that the most skeptical, reasonable person in the room would look at Magnus Crow and understand what they were looking at. Klein, in those 2 visits, showed her something she hadn't expected, which was that he was genuinely good at this, at the precise, careful work of identifying which piece of evidence did which job. He'd spent years in the operational side of what turned out to be a criminal enterprise, and in that process he'd developed an understanding of how each mechanism worked and where its pressure points were. Turned toward dismantling rather than enabling, the same knowledge was formidable. "You should have been doing something else," Miriam said once, near the end of the second visit. She didn't mean it critically, she just meant it. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that for about 4 months. He picked up his coat. "You think this is going to work?" "I think it has the best chance of anything we've been able to put together," she said. "That's not quite the same as yes." "No, it's not." He nodded and left, and she sat with her files for another hour before banking the stove for the night. March arrived with a thaw that turned the roads to mud, which was in some ways worse than frozen ground. Harder on the horses, harder on the wagons, everything slower and heavier. The spring livestock auction was held annually at the Millhaven Fairgrounds, 32 miles east of Dalton Creek, and it was the largest single gathering of ranching and agricultural families in the territory. Several hundred people attended from across the county and beyond, buyers and sellers and representatives from the Territorial Land Office and the banking institutions, and always a contingent from the larger commercial interests that had their fingers in the agricultural economy. Magnus Crow attended every year. Miriam had confirmed this with 3 separate sources. He came for 2 days, moved through the auction floors with a small contingent of associates, conducted business in the way that large men conduct business in public, visibly, confidently, as if the space belonged to them by right. The plan was simple in structure, which was the best kind of plan. Gideon would request the floor during the open forum portion of the second morning session, a standard practice at the auction where ranchers could raise community concerns before the main business of the day began. He would present the case. Miriam would stand beside him with the organized evidence. The affected families, distributed through the crowd, would each be prepared to stand and confirm their part of the pattern when called upon. And Arthur Klein would be there, positioned near the back, waiting. 3 days before the auction, Evelyn Mercer came to Frost Ridge. Miriam was in the yard when the buggy arrived, checking the fence line on the near paddock. She saw the buggy from a distance, recognized the horse, and stood where she was and waited. Evelyn climbed down with the particular composure of a woman who believed composure was a form of power, which it sometimes was. She was dressed well for a ranch call, which meant she'd planned the visit, and the planning included the visual. "Mrs. Ashcroft," she said, crossing the yard. "I was hoping to find you." "Mrs. Mercer." Miriam's voice was neutral. Evelyn stopped a comfortable distance away and looked around at the ranch. The temporary structure where the barn had been, the paddock, the house, with an expression Miriam couldn't fully read. It might have been assessment. It might have been something older and less comfortable. "I understand you've been having a difficult season," Evelyn said. "Most ranches in the county have," Miriam said. "Yes." A pause. "I've been thinking about Frost Ridge. My husband has some connections that might be useful. There's a buyer who's expressed interest in the property, if the family ever considered—" "The family isn't considering selling," Miriam said. Evelyn's composure adjusted by a small, precise amount. "Of course. I only meant that options exist." "I understand what you meant." Miriam looked at her directly. "Is there something else you came to say, Mrs. Mercer?" Something moved in Evelyn's face, a calculation, quickly completed. "I've heard some talk," she said carefully, "from various people, about activities the Hale family has been involved in. I'd hate for Gideon to find himself in a position where certain associations caused him difficulties." The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the near paddock, one of the horses moved. Miriam looked at Evelyn Mercer. The careful dress, the composed face, the eyes that were doing more work than the voice. And she thought about 11 families, and a burned barn, and a 7-year-old girl asking if they were going to lose the ranch. "I appreciate you driving all the way out here," Miriam said. "It was a long way to come for a conversation that isn't going to change anything." Evelyn's composure held, but only barely. "I'm trying to help." "No," Miriam said, very simply. "You're not." They stood there for a moment, and then Evelyn turned and walked back to her buggy and drove away, and Miriam watched her go and then went back to checking the fence. She told Gideon about the visit that evening. He listened, jaw tight, and then said, "She knows we're moving. She suspects. There's a difference." Miriam folded the paper she'd been holding. "But it means we can't wait. Whatever we're going to do, we do it at the auction, and not after." He looked at her. "Are you ready?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd noticed was the way he thought about everything, not performing certainty, not collapsing into doubt, just actually checking. "Close enough," he said. The morning of March 15th was cold and clear, the kind of winter and day that promised more cold before it delivered spring. They left Frost Ridge before dawn, Gideon and Miriam in the wagon, Cody riding alongside, the files packed carefully in a waterproofed case that Miriam had made herself from oilcloth and a wooden frame. Ruth had insisted on coming, and after a brief argument that Ruth had won by pointing out that she was 14 and not a child, and she had a right to see how it ended, she was in the wagon bed with a blanket over her knees. The Millhaven Fairgrounds, by 9 in the morning, held more people than Miriam had seen in one place since leaving Billings. The livestock pens ran along the east side of the main building, and the sound of cattle and horses and the particular organized chaos of the auction filled the air before they'd even hitched the wagon. She could see the Voss family's wagon 3 rows over, and the Henshaw buggy beyond that, and further along, the Harmon brothers' enclosed wagon that served as their mobile supply operation. Everyone was here. Miriam stood for a moment in the noise and the cold, holding the oilcloth case, and ran through everything in her head one more time. Not out of anxiety, or not only out of anxiety, but out of the same habit she'd always had of checking the whole picture before acting on any part of it. The open forum began at 10. The auction master, a big man named Pruitt, who'd been running the Millhaven auction for 15 years, called for community business, and there was the usual minute of crowd shuffling before Gideon raised his hand from the middle of the floor. Pruitt recognized him. "Gideon Hale, Dalton Creek, the floor is yours." The sound in the room adjusted, not quiet, but different, the particular recalibration of a large crowd that sensed something unusual is about to happen. Miriam moved through the press of bodies to stand at Gideon's right, and she felt the shift as people registered her presence. A woman standing in the speaking position at the floor, which was uncommon enough to add its own current of attention. Gideon spoke. He started with the barn, the way she'd coached him. The visual truth of standing in a yard at midnight watching your father's work burn, and the room heard it. You could feel that it heard it. He moved through the sequence of events at Frost Ridge with deliberate, unadorned precision. Credit pulled, cattle poisoned, waterline cut, fire. He didn't editorialize. He let the sequence carry its own weight. Then he said, "This didn't only happen to my ranch." He named names, one by one, and as each name was spoken, the person or family it belonged to stood up. Carl and Eleanor Voss, Pete and Doris Henshaw, Frank Dalton, Walt Briggs, the Harmon brothers. 8 families in total scattered through the crowd, standing. The room had gone genuinely quiet now. Miriam stepped forward. She did not ask permission, and she did not apologize for being there. She opened the oilcloth case and began to present the documentation in the clear, organized way she'd been preparing for 2 months. Not reading it verbatim, but walking the crowd through it the way you'd walk someone through a building, showing them how the room's connected. The Crow Basin, properties filings, the purchase records and the prices, the dates of the financial pressures and the dates of the livestock deaths and the dates of the accidents laid beside each other so the sequence was visible, the fire investigation report, the rental log, the formal complaint filed with the Territorial Land Commissioner 1 week prior. She watched the faces in the crowd while she spoke. She was looking for the particular expression of someone who was hearing something that aligned with something they already knew, the slight forward lean, the jaw that tightened, the eyes that went sideways to a spouse or neighbor with a quick private wait. She found it in more faces than she'd expected. From somewhere near the middle of the room, a voice said, "The same thing happened to the Courtner Ranch in Harding County." Another voice, from a different direction. "The Blaine property. They sold in November. I always thought the price was wrong." Pruitt had stopped managing the room. He was listening too. Then Magnus Crow spoke. He was positioned near the east wall with 3 other men. Large, well-dressed, the particular stillness of someone who's controlled rooms for 40 years and is recalibrating. His voice was measured and carried the natural authority of a man who was used to being believed. "These are serious accusations," he said, "and they're being made without any evidence of direct connection to my organization. Property transfers are public record. If distressed properties were available at market prices, that's not—" "Mr. Crow," the voice came from the back of the room. Arthur Klein walked forward. He moved slowly because he was a man in poor health who had driven 32 miles in the cold and was frightened in a way that showed in every step. But he walked forward. The crowd parted slightly. Everyone knew him, or knew the type of him. The working man who disappears into the machinery of large operations and is rarely seen at all until the machinery breaks. He stopped near the center of the room. He looked at Magnus Crow across the space between them. "The assessor for the Dalton Creek operations was a man named Garrett," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "He produced written recommendations for the sequencing of pressure on 6 target ranches. I was present when he presented 2 of those recommendations. I have records of both meetings." He paused. "I can also tell this room that the Henshaw barn fire was discussed in advance as a necessary escalation, and the instruction was given by a man whose name I wrote down the same afternoon." The room made a sound that wasn't quite any one thing. Crow's composure didn't break. But something in his eyes shifted. The particular micro-adjustment of a man who's assessed the situation and found that the position he's standing in is different from the one he thought he was standing in. "That's the testimony of a disgruntled former employee," he said. "It's not—" "My records are dated," Klein said. "They corroborate Mrs. Ashcroft's documentation at 11 specific points. I'd be glad to go through them point by point." Another voice from the crowd, louder now. "I want to hear them." And then another. "So do I." And then the room was no longer something Crow could manage, because the particular thing that happens when a crowd shifts from audience to participant had happened, and it was irreversible. Rancher after rancher was speaking. Not all of them from Dalton Creek. Not all of them people Miriam had spoken to or prepared. People who had their own versions of the same story, their own suspended suspicions about transactions that hadn't felt right, their own losses that hadn't had an explanation until 30 seconds ago. Gideon stood in the middle of it and looked at Miriam, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. The Territorial Land Commissioner's deputy, who had been in attendance at the auction on routine business and had been standing near the north wall when Gideon had begun speaking, pushed through the crowd to where Pruitt was standing and said something close to his ear. Pruitt nodded, and then the deputy crossed the room with two men behind him, and Magnus Crow watched them come with the face of a man doing a very fast and very private accounting. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that fiction sometimes makes these moments. No shouting, no physical struggle, no final confrontation that resolves everything cleanly. The deputy spoke quietly to Crow, and Crow's lawyer spoke quietly back, and there was a period of perhaps 20 minutes during which the auction floor held several hundred people in a specific suspension, waiting. Then Magnus Crow left the building with the deputy and his men. He walked out without speaking again. His associates followed. Miriam watched him go. She felt, in that moment, something she'd been carrying for 3 months release from somewhere in her body. Not triumph, not the clean satisfaction of a resolved story, but the simpler, exhausted relief of a weight finally set down. Around her, the room was still going. People were talking, comparing. The air electric, with the particular energy of something suppressed for a long time, suddenly permitted to move. Gideon appeared at her shoulder. He said very quietly, "It worked." "The commissioner still has to act on the complaint," she said. "The legal process takes time. There's still—" "Miriam." He waited until she looked at him. "It worked." She looked at the room, at Carl Voss with his arm around Eleanor, at Pete Henshaw with his face doing something complicated and ungovernable, at Arthur Klein standing alone near the center of the floor, looking like a man who'd just put something down that he'd carried too long, at Ruth, who had been standing in the crowd near the door the whole time, and who was now looking at Miriam with an expression that Miriam recognized, because she'd felt it herself at 14. The specific, exhausted relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and finally remembers how to breathe out. "Yes," she said, "it worked." The legal machinery would take months to fully engage. She knew that, and Gideon knew it, and the families who'd lost land and cattle and barns knew it too. The work was not finished. It was possibly not even mostly finished. But the thing that had been running the darkness at the edge of the valley had been brought into the light. And in the light, it was revealed to be what all such things are when finally seen clearly. Not invincible, not inevitable, just a structure built by ordinary human greed that could be dismantled by ordinary human will. The auction went on. Business continued, because it always does. Cattle were sold and horses were assessed and feed contracts were negotiated, and through all of it, the ranching families of the territory moved differently than they had when they'd arrived. Something looser in the shoulders, something easier in the exchanges between people who'd been quietly frightened for months. On the drive back to Dalton Creek, Ruth fell asleep in the wagon bed, which she hadn't done since she was about 9 years old. Cody rode quietly alongside. The landscape in the March late afternoon was the particular color of a winter beginning to lose its grip. Not spring yet, not even close, but the quality of the cold was different, less final. Gideon drove and Miriam sat beside him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." She looked at the road. "You don't have to." "I do, though." He paused. "I do." She didn't answer. The horses' hooves on the thawing road, the last of the afternoon light going orange on the ridge above Dalton Creek. She was tired in a way that went all the way down, and she was glad. And she was thinking about the ranch she was driving back to, and the girls sleeping in the rooms of it, and the work that was still to be done and would always be to be done. And how all of that, the tiredness and the gladness and the work, had come to feel, without her fully planning it, like something she belonged to. That was the feeling she sat with as Frost Ridge came into view around the long bend, the kitchen window lit from inside where the stove was still burning, the temporary barn structure dark against a darkening sky. The whole place worn and real, and hers in some way she hadn't started this with. Home was a word she'd been careful with for 3 years. She was starting to be less careful with it, The legal process was exactly as slow as Miriam had told everyone it would be, which didn't make it any easier to live inside. March became April. The mud dried, and the first real warmth came off the ridge. And the temporary barn structure that Pete Henshaw and Walt Briggs and Carl Voss had helped frame in February got its roof properly finished in the second week of April, when 8 men showed up on a Saturday morning without being asked and worked until the light ran out. Gideon stood in the yard watching it happen and had the particular difficulty men have when they receive help they needed badly and didn't know how to ask for. He kept finding things to do with his hands. He kept walking back and forth between the supply pile and the structure. Cody finally said, quietly, from beside him, "Boss, just let them do it." He did. It was harder than it sounds. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office had opened a formal investigation within 10 days of the Millhaven auction, which was faster than Miriam had projected and spoke to how much the public disclosure had moved things. 2 investigators arrived in Dalton Creek in the last week of March. Serious, methodical men who went through the documents Miriam had compiled with the thoroughness of people who understood what they were looking at and were glad to finally be looking at it. They spent 4 days in the county, interviewing the affected families and examining the property transfer records at Robert Mercer's brokerage. And when they left, they took 3 boxes of materials with them. Robert Mercer, it turned out, had known more than Miriam had been certain of, and less than he could have. His brokerage had been used as a mechanism, the paperwork flowing through it clean and properly formatted, the properties transferred legally, nothing on the surface of any transaction that should have triggered alarm. Whether he'd noticed the pattern and chosen not to look more closely was a question that occupied the investigators for several weeks. In the end, he was not charged with anything, but his brokerage license came under review, and Evelyn's role in coordinating the information that fed Crow's operation was documented in sufficient detail that she resigned from every community committee she'd held and left Dalton Creek by the end of May. Where she went, nobody in town said out loud, though most people had opinions. Miriam heard about Evelyn's departure from Eleanor Voss, who mentioned it without particular satisfaction, because Eleanor was not a person who found satisfaction in other people's downfall even when those people had earned it. She made choices, Eleanor said simply. Now she lives with them. That was the end of Eleanor's commentary on Evelyn Mercer, and Miriam thought it was probably the right amount. Magnus Crow's situation took longer to resolve, because large men with money and lawyers always take longer. The Territorial Attorney General's office took over the criminal portion of the investigation from the Land Commissioner in April, and the process that followed involved more paperwork and more delays and more procedural motions than anyone who hadn't been through something like it would have believed possible. Miriam had prepared the families for this, had said explicitly in the barn meetings and the warehouse meetings and the kitchen table conversations that had sustained the whole effort through winter, that the legal process would be frustrating and slow and would require them to hold their patience long after the dramatic moment had passed. She'd been right, and being right about it didn't make the waiting easier. But things were moving. That was what she kept telling people, and what she kept reminding herself on the days when moving wasn't visible. Things were moving, and the direction of the movement was right, and direction mattered more than speed. Magnus Crow was formally charged in May with conspiracy to defraud, illegal manipulation of credit instruments, and 3 counts of accessory to property destruction, the last category covering the Henshaw fire and the Frost Ridge barn, and the deliberate contamination of the Voss water line. His lawyers entered not guilty pleas and requested delays, which were partially granted, which meant the trial would not happen until autumn at the earliest. But the charges were on record. His assets were under review, and Crow Basin Properties had been suspended from conducting further transactions in the territory pending the outcome of the investigation. The 7 properties purchased by Crow Basin at distressed prices were subject to separate civil proceedings, which were complicated and slow and would require each of the selling families to make their own legal decisions about whether to pursue recovery. Some of them could afford to. Some of them couldn't. That was one of the places where the story didn't resolve cleanly, and Miriam had made her peace with that, though it sat with her in the way that unfinished things do. Pete and Doris Henshaw got their land back. Their case was the most straightforward, the documentation the most complete, and the timeline of financial pressure to forced sale the most compressed, and therefore the most visible. The Territorial Court ruled in June that the transaction had been conducted under duress manufactured by the buyer, and the property was returned with damages that covered approximately 60% of what they'd lost in the process. It wasn't whole, Pete said, sitting at the Frost Ridge kitchen table with coffee going cold in front of him. That 60% was more than he'd had any right to expect 6 months ago. Doris didn't say anything. She just put her hand over his on the table. Miriam looked away. There were things between a husband and a wife that weren't for other people's eyes, even kind ones. The Dalton Creek community changed in the months after the auction, in the particular way communities change when something they've been separately afraid of is collectively named and addressed. It didn't become easier or more harmonious overnight. That wasn't how people worked. And Dalton Creek was full of people who had complicated histories with each other that predated Magnus Crow by decades. But there was a loosening, a sense of people being less guarded with each other, less privately protective of their own difficulties, more likely to mention a problem to a neighbor before the problem became a crisis. Some of that, Miriam knew, would last. Some of it would fade as time created distance from the shared experience that had generated it. That was also how people worked, and she didn't hold it against them. What she did hold on to was the specific, particular relationships that had formed in the doing of it. Carl and Eleanor Voss, who had become something close to family, Pete and Doris Henshaw, who sent produce every time they had surplus, Arthur Klein, who had sent a short letter in April saying he was doing better and had found different work that he could live with, old Frank Dalton, who was not an easy or warm man but who had, at the end of the last barn meeting, looked at Miriam and said simply, "You did right by this valley," and meant every word of it. She thought about Klein sometimes, about the courage it takes to know you've been part of something wrong, and to decide, in the specific moment when it costs the most, to step away from it. She didn't think courage was the right word for the easy version of that, the version where stepping away is safe or convenient. Real courage was what Klein had done, stepping away when it wasn't safe, when the cost was real and the outcome uncertain. She respected it without romanticizing it, which she thought was the right way to respect something. At Frost Ridge, the spring work consumed everything in the way it always did. Calving and planting and fencing, and the 100 daily urgencies that came with running a working ranch when the ground had thawed and the days had lengthened, and the animals had needs that didn't wait for anyone's legal proceedings or personal reckonings. Gideon worked hard, the way he'd always worked, but something in it had shifted since January. He was still up before 4:30, but he came in for meals now. Actually came in, sat down, ate rather than eating, standing at the counter, while already thinking about the next thing. He'd started talking to the girls differently, not just dispatching responsibilities or checking in on practical matters, but actually talking, the way a parent talks when they've remembered that their children are people they find interesting. Ruth noticed. She mentioned it to Miriam one evening in April while they were doing dishes side by side, which was when most of their real conversations happened. Doing something else, not looking directly at each other, both of them more honest in that posture than they were face to face. "He's different," Ruth said. She meant her father. "A little," Miriam agreed. "More like he was before." Ruth paused, considering whether to say the next thing. She said it. "Before Mom died." The water ran. Miriam handed a clean pot to Ruth to dry. "Not the same," Miriam said carefully. "He's not going to be the same as he was then. That's not how grief works. But maybe something like himself again. His own version of after." Ruth turned the pot over in her hands. "Is that enough?" "I think it might be," Miriam said. "What do you think?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said finally. "I think it might be too." It was the most direct conversation they'd had about any of it, and they didn't expand on it, because Ruth was 16 and had the particular reticence about her own feelings that came from years of not having room to have them, and Miriam respected the pace at which she was willing to open the door. You couldn't rush people toward their own realizations. You could only stay steady enough that they knew the door would still be there when they were ready. Nora had by that spring become so thoroughly herself again that it was sometimes startling, the velocity of her opinions, the questions that went sideways before they went straight, the running commentary on everything from the behavior of the horses to the political situation in the territorial capital, which she was now reading about in 2 newspapers simultaneously and had strong feelings about. She'd started writing her own essays, which she showed to Miriam first, and which Miriam read carefully and commented on honestly, not just encouragingly, because honest engagement was what Nora wanted, and empty praise was something she could smell coming from 3 rooms away. One of the essays was about the valley and what had happened to it. Not dramatic, not grandiose, just Nora's clear-eyed 11-year-old accounting of what fear does to a community and what happens when someone decides not to be governed by it. She gave it to Miriam and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her read it. When Miriam finished, she set it down and looked at Nora. "This is good," she said. Nora's face did the complicated thing it did when she wanted very much to receive a compliment and wasn't sure how. "Really?" The second paragraph is stronger than the first, but the last line is exactly right. She picked it up and read it back. "The thing about fear is that it only works if you're alone with it." She looked at Nora. "Yes, that's exactly right." Nora stood a little straighter. She took the essay back and went to her room, and Miriam heard her moving around up there. The particular sound of someone who has received something real and needs to be alone with it for a minute. Beth, for her part, had developed an operational partnership with Miriam that resembled less a child-adult relationship and more a very small ranch manager learning from a slightly larger one. She tracked things: water levels, feed consumption, which of the chickens were producing and which weren't, the approximate number of days until specific calves would be ready to move from the south paddock. She reported these things with a precision that was sometimes more than anyone had asked for and always more than you expected from a 7-year-old, and Miriam listened to every report with the seriousness it deserved, because dismissing a child's genuine work was one of the small cruelties she'd never been able to tolerate. She'd been at Frost Ridge for 7 months when summer arrived properly, and in those 7 months the person she'd been when she'd stepped off the stage in Dalton Creek with one bag and a folded newspaper had not disappeared, but had been joined by other things. By the particular knowledge of how the wind came off the North Ridge in the evening, by the sound of the house settling at night, by the specific weight of a place that had become, without her precisely choosing it, the context in which she was living her life. She still wasn't sure what to do with that. The question had been sitting at the edge of her thinking for weeks, not urgently, but persistently, the way an object in your peripheral vision keeps drawing the eye. She'd been hired as a housekeeper. That remained technically true. The household she was keeping had changed shape around her. The work had expanded well beyond its original definition, and the woman doing it had become something that didn't have a clean professional title. But none of that changed the structure, which was that she was an employee, and the ranch belonged to Gideon, and the girls were his daughters, and whatever she'd become to them existed within that structure, whether she felt it as a structure or not. Gideon was also sitting with something. She'd noticed it in the way she noticed most things, not through a single clear signal, but through accumulation. The way he'd started lingering at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed, rather than going straight to the survey maps or the account books. The way he'd started asking her opinion on things that weren't strictly her domain, ranch decisions, a grazing rotation he was considering, a question about whether to sell 2 of the spring calves now or hold them through summer. The way he looked at her sometimes, just for a half second, when he thought she wasn't watching. She was always watching. That was simply how she was built. She didn't do anything about it, because doing something about it required knowing what the right thing to do was, and she wasn't sure. She was 36 years old, and she'd been a widow for 3 years, and she was practical enough to know the difference between gratitude and something else, and careful enough to want to be certain she knew which one she was looking at before she acted on it. The night he finally said something was the 24th of December. Christmas Eve at Frost Ridge was not elaborate. They didn't have the means for elaborate, and Miriam had not pushed for it. What they had was a good fire in the front room, a proper meal that had taken most of the day to prepare and that everyone had contributed to in some way, including Cody, who had peeled more potatoes than strictly necessary while providing a running narration of the experience that had made Beth laugh until she had to sit down. The tree was a real one that Gideon and Cody had cut from the north slope, slightly lopsided, decorated with whatever was on hand, strips of red flannel, pine cones that Beth and Nora had gathered and painted with the last of the White House paint, a string of dried cranberries that had taken Ruth 3 evenings to complete, and that she pretended had been less effort than it was. After supper, the girls had settled in the front room, Beth asleep in the chair by the fire, Nora reading, Ruth mending something with the focused patience she brought to all fine work. Cody had gone out to check on the horses and had, with considerable and transparent tact, not come back in. Gideon found Miriam in the kitchen, washing up the last of the dishes with the particular efficiency of someone who doesn't want to stop moving because stopping means sitting with herself. He came in and picked up the drying cloth and started drying without being asked. They worked in silence for a few minutes. The fire in the kitchen stove, the sound of wind at the window. From the front room, the occasional murmur of Nora turning a page. "I want to say something," Gideon said, "and I want to say it right. And I'm not entirely sure I know how." Miriam kept washing. "Try the direct version. You're better at direct than you think." He put down the pot he was drying. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were close enough in the small kitchen that the space between them was a deliberate thing. "When you got off that stage in October," he said, "I looked at you and I had a thought that I'm not proud of. I thought, this isn't what I needed. This isn't going to be what the girls need." He paused. "I was wrong about that in every specific way a person can be wrong about something." Miriam said nothing. She waited. "You saved this ranch," he said. "But that's not the thing, actually. I could probably have saved the ranch another way, eventually. What I couldn't have—" He stopped again. Started differently. "Beth knows what a water trough is and why it matters. Ruth sat down at a kitchen table this fall and did nothing for 20 minutes, and it was the best thing I've seen in 2 years. Nora talks. She just talks, all the time, the way she used to." His voice did something at that last part. He didn't look away from it. "That's not the ranch. That's my children. That's my family. And it's different because you came here and stayed." The fire settled. Outside the window, snow was coming down in the slow, unhurried way it came down on still nights. "I'm not asking you to stay because you saved the ranch," he said. "I'm asking you because this house, this family, is not what it would have been without you in it. And I am not what I would have been. And I've been trying to figure out the right way to say that for about 4 months, and I think the right way is just to say it." Miriam set down the cup she was holding. She turned fully to face him. She thought about the stage stop in October. The look on his face when he'd seen her, that brief, quickly managed flicker of having expected something else. She'd seen it, filed it away, decided it wasn't her problem. She'd spent 7 months proving, through the daily accumulation of ordinary work, that what a person looked like arriving somewhere had nothing to do with what they were capable of once they got there. She thought about a burned barn and a kitchen table, and a 7-year-old asking a hard question and being given an honest answer. She thought about Ruth's hands still for 20 minutes, and Nora's voice finding its pitch again, and Beth's face when she'd said, "Yes, I can make apple pie." She thought about what it cost to be alone with grief and what it meant to stop being alone with it. "I'm not an easy person to live with," she said. "I notice everything and I have opinions about most of it, and I don't always wait to be asked before I share them." "I know," he said. "I've noticed. I'm not Clara. I can't be that for your girls. I can be what I am, which is something else." "I'm not asking for Clara," he said. And the steadiness in his voice when he said it told her that this was something he'd worked out honestly over time, not something he was saying for convenience. "I'm asking for Miriam Ashcroft." She looked at him for a long moment. He held still for it, that particular quality he had of being able to wait for something without filling the space with noise. She'd respected that about him from fairly early on and still did. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, yes? Or all right, you've heard me?" "All right, yes," she said. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, not the way things change in stories, but in the small, real way that happens when something a person has been quietly bracing against for a while suddenly doesn't require bracing anymore. He reached out and took her hand, which was still damp from the dishwater, and held it in both of his. They stood there in the kitchen for a minute. Just that. Then Beth's voice came from the front room, sleepy and slightly suspicious. "Is someone in the kitchen?" "Yes," Miriam called back. "What are you doing?" Gideon looked at Miriam. A corner of his mouth moved. She felt it pull at something in her chest that had been cautious for a long time. "Talking," Miriam said. A pause. "About what?" "Come in here, and we'll tell you," Gideon said. The sound of Beth extracting herself from the chair. The thud of small feet. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. hair sideways from sleep, looking at both of them with the unfiltered assessment of a child who is deciding what she's seeing. She looked at their hands. She looked at their faces. She was 7 years old, and she had been paying attention to the adults in her house all autumn and winter and spring, and she understood more than anyone had told her. "Oh," she said. And then, with the directness that had always been her particular gift, "Good." She turned around and went back to the front room, and a moment later they heard her say something to Nora, and Nora's voice in response, and then Ruth's, and whatever was said produced a quiet that felt different from the quiet before it. Fuller, somehow. More decided. Gideon looked at Miriam. "I should warn you," she said, "that the girls are going to have opinions about everything." "I know," he said. "They come by it honestly." She didn't respond to that, but she didn't look away either. They told the girls together, that evening in the front room with the lopsided tree and the flannel strips and the fire burning low and warm. It was not a long conversation, and it was not a perfectly managed one. Ruth went quiet in the particular way that meant she was processing something significant and needed time she wasn't going to ask for. And Nora asked 3 questions in quick succession about practical arrangements that were both entirely typical of Nora, and also a way of not addressing the part that was harder to address. And Beth had already apparently decided her position and communicated it by moving to sit beside Miriam on the settee and leaning against her arm. Ruth came to Miriam's room that night, late, when the house had gone quiet. She stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Miriam waited. "I want you to know," Ruth said finally, "that I'm glad you stayed. At the beginning, I didn't want you here." She said it plainly, without apology or excessive guilt. "I want you to know I know that. And I want you to know it changed." "I know it changed," Miriam said. "I watched it change. It took about a week and a half." Ruth's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "It took longer than that. The pie negotiation was day 1. You were half gone by day 1. Ruth did smile then, briefly and reluctantly and genuinely, and it was so much like the smile she'd had at 12 before she'd had to become competent at everything that it caught Miriam somewhere unguarded. "Good night," Ruth said. "Good night," Miriam said. The door closed. The house settled. Outside the window, the snow was still coming down on the valley, covering the place where the old barn had been, covering the fences and the paddocks, and the long road down to Dalton Creek, making the landscape clean and quiet and indifferent to everything humans had done on top of it. Miriam lay awake for a while, not because she was troubled, but because she was the kind of person who needed to be awake with things before she could set them down and sleep. She lay there and thought about October, and the stage stop, and the plain truth that she'd shown up in someone else's life at the exact moment the house was on the edge of going dark, and had stayed and had done the work, and had, through no plan of her own, but through the simple daily fact of being present and paying attention, become something she hadn't been when she arrived. She didn't think she was a different person. She thought she was the same person, more completely herself than she'd been in years. That was the thing nobody talked about when they talked about saving things. You show up to save a family, and in the process of doing the work, something in you that had been waiting gets called into use. Not the heroic version, not the version where you know what you're doing and move through it gracefully, but the actual version, where you're tired and uncertain and you keep going anyway because the work is there and somebody has to do it, and you happen to be the person who's here. And in the keeping going, you find out what you're made of, not what you hoped you were made of, what you actually are. She thought that was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The morning came the way it always does in Montana in December, slow and gray and necessary, the light building without drama over the ridge until the whole valley was visible in its winter stillness. Frost Ridge stood in it the way it had stood for 22 years, worn and solid and belonging to the landscape. Inside, the stove was going. Beth was already up. She was always already up, and the sound of her moving around the kitchen came through the floor in the particular pattern Miriam had come to know as well as any other sound in the house. Downstairs, Gideon was putting his coat on. They looked at each other in the way they'd looked at each other all autumn and winter and spring, except now there was nothing they were carefully not saying. "Coffee's on," Miriam said. "I'll be back in an hour," he said. "Fence line on the south ridge." "I know," she said. I'll have breakfast ready." He went out. She went to the kitchen. Beth immediately began reporting on the water situation in the South Trough, which had iced overnight by her calculation, and Miriam listened to every word of it. The valley outside the window was white and still and wide, and the legal proceedings were ongoing, and the new barn wasn't finished, and the spring work was months away but already pressing at the edge of thought, and there was more ahead of them than behind them, which was how Miriam preferred it. She started breakfast. The morning light came off the ridge and through the kitchen window and fell across the table where the account book sat, and the newspapers sat, and the coffee was getting warm, and somewhere outside the south fence line, Gideon was checking the posts, and upstairs Ruth and Nora were beginning to wake up, and at Miriam's elbow Beth was still talking, and the stove was warm, and the house was full of the sounds of a family that had chosen each other. It was not perfect. It was not simple. It was going to require work every single day for the rest of their lives, and some of those days were going to be hard in ways they couldn't yet see. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that was the whole of it. That was everything.